Hi everybody, this is our first Webisode, in English 495. This is my first time kind of doing lectures with the computer, so it's a little bit strange not to see you face to face. If you look carefully into my glasses, you can see that I'm talking to myself, which maybe is what I've always wanted. So, alright, these webisodes are designed so that we can talk through some of the major themes in the text that we're reading at this given time. This week, is it backwards? Castle of Otranto is what we're talking about. There's no real way for me to monitor if you're listening or not, so you can have Facebook up on the side, or you could, if you got annoyed with what I was saying, you could mute me. Everybody's favorite dream, to mute their professor. But hopefully these are helpful. I just want to talk through some of the major things that are going on so we have a better sense of what to do with this very strange novel that we just read. To begin, Horace Walpole, noted really only because of this novel, for one, and the second thing he's noted for is building his castle. He built a private castle on Strawberry Hill in the Gothic style, something that at that point was unheard of. So he really began a trend of being the eclectic loner who builds a Gothic castle for himself, and also for building a literary Gothic castle for himself. Up until the Castle of Otranto, it was very rare in modern times to have a story that actually involved the supernatural. Not the natural, and then someone thinks they hear something, it seems mysterious, and then ultimately it ends up being nothing at all, a figment of their imagination. In this novel, as you have already seen, in the end, it is in fact the supernatural. The supernatural has invaded into the natural and dominated it in some sense. So that is something that makes this very interesting. Other things, the style, the technique, these things were very, very strange, and no conversation about the Castle of Otranto could possibly begin without the opening scene. Probably one of the strangest opening scenes in all of literature. This is on page 28. You'll remember what happens in the beginning. Everything seems to be going okay. The early pages seem to be a domestic drama of some kind is unfolding. And then Manfred beheld his child dashed to pieces and almost buried under an enormous helmet, 100 times more large than any casque ever made for human being, and shaded with a proportionable quantity of black feathers. What? There is a huge helmet that has just fallen in Manfred's courtyard, and it is surrounded by black feathers. Where did it come from? What just happened? His son has been killed by a gigantic helmet. So, your response may have been, what? And that would be a natural response for this. Very strange opening. But again, it's setting the tone. This is why this is kind of the prototype for the Gothic novel. It's setting the tone in that, from this point forward, excess is the name of the game. It's about emotion, not about something that could or could not happen in the real world. Perfectly okay in the Gothic world for a giant helmet to crush your son. Why shouldn't it? The supernatural has the upper hand over the reasonable, realistic world. Okay, so any discussion has to begin with that opening scene, infamous for its excesses. The second thing I want to talk about when discussing this is that a lot of the tropes that is, the symbols and themes that appear in the Castle of Otranto, will be used for hundreds of years afterwards. We still see them today. Some of the tropes that you'll remember: a portrait leaving the frame on the wall and coming to life. That kind of uncanny sensation where there are many permutations of it. The picture that watches you when you pass by. The sense that a picture is living and dead at the same moment. That is kind of a trope that is taken here and developed further on. Of course, it's interesting because this is exactly the kind of uncanniness that will come to mark later 20th century after Sigmund Freud, the psychoanalyst, as we talked about last time, or I read and you clicked through. Much before Freud will kind of come out and introduce us to the uncanny as an academic topic, Walpole is drawing our attention to it early on here. Another trope that will become very famous: the madman who chases the maiden. Manfred goes insane and becomes a madman and chases a number of beautiful young maidens through his castle. This is a kind of trope that is apparent all the way through Gothic literature into horror films. The notion that the patriarch, who is supposedly the master of reason, the most powerful, wealthy, influential person, at the center of the novel, loses his mind. And that's a Gothic trope. He goes from rationality to insanity. And the victim, from this point forward, is often beautiful young women. That would be a fascination of Edgar Allan Poe, who we'll read later in the semester. But beautiful women seem to embody the fragility, the weakness, the innocence that is threatened by the chaos unleashed in the Gothic novel. And finally, another trope that is very prominent, probably because Horace Walpole built his own Gothic castle, is the labyrinth that is Manfred's estate. It goes from a very orderly and calculated aristocratic manner to a cavern-like twisted consortium of tunnels with darkness and shadows, and everyone gets lost and confused. The reader is just kind of at a loss as to where are these characters located, where are they going. They seem to be breaking the bonds of time and space here. This labyrinth quality is something that we see countless times after this. The noble manner brought to chaos. All right, so opening scene, the tropes that are the most important to take away from this very strange novel. We have to talk a little bit about Manfred himself, the madman behind all of the devastation unleashed in the novel. You'll notice the Spartan. These are the cups that I have in my home. Okay, the Manfred's search for absolute power, and we discussed this a little bit in last time. Again, I use discuss loosely. Manfred believes that he is the most powerful creature in the world and beyond. He seems to think that he has usurped not only this estate from Alfonso the Great's or Alfonso the Good's lineage, he seized it and he has usurped God. He believes himself to be a kind of immortal, impenetrable force. And he yells on page 34, "Heaven nor hell shall impede my designs." This becomes ever more important as he begins to lose grasp over his actual standing in the material world and seems to get higher and higher inflated. He's reminded of this by monks and hermits who keep telling him, you need to back off a little bit. You are not God. But he doesn't buy it. He thinks he is he's above everything and everyone. So heaven or hell shall impede my designs. He's in a struggle not only for power, for absolute power. And if the Gothic novel teaches us nothing else, it is that, and we'll discuss this more as we go forward, it's that you can't, if you try to achieve absolute power, you will be brought down by the darkness of your own excesses. And there are a couple of different fronts that those appear on that we'll come back to, but it is man overreaching. Ellen Morse, who we're going to read her essay when she's talking about Frankenstein, will famously say that the Gothic is about the history of overreachers, a history of men who believe that there are no limitations for them. Kind of like the Gothic cathedral. And with Manfred, we see him reaching higher and higher and higher, but his excesses are also the foundation of his doom. He reaches a certain height and then collapses into madness. Okay, so here we have the friar, who obviously represents the complete opposite of everything Manfred does with his wealth and excessive search for power. And he says, it's on page 55, quote, "If it is the will of the Most High that Manfred's name must perish, resign yourself, my lord, to its decrees, and thus deserve a crown that can never pass away." Here, we see that Manfred is obsessed with his name lasting for eternity. He's obsessed with his legacy. And he thinks that by having this legacy, and of course this all begins when his son is destroyed, the last of his lineage is destroyed, he believes that the continuation of his name will secure his own immortality. The problem, as the friar points out, is that you cannot be eternal. Although Alfonso the Good makes maybe a different case, we have to come back to him at the end. That is the take-home message on page 104. Behold the vanity of human greatness. And that is kind of the motto, I think, of the Castle of Otranto. It is, behold the vanity of human greatness. When a character believes that they can be immortal, that they can actually achieve that immortality, their fate is sealed and they will be undone by their own excessive nature. Now, let's talk a little bit more about this, because I do think this is at the root of everything. On page 87, "If the Marquis accepts Matilda's hand, I know she will readily obey. Heaven may interpose and prevent the rest." On one hand, we have the kind of argument that's being put forward that heaven will interject. Heaven will, the Almighty will reach out, stop this madness from happening. But very shortly thereafter, on page 89, Hippolyta knows that there are very real consequences on earth. "Thy fate depends on thy father," she says to Matilda. And then Jerome, later on page 89, further emphasizes the paternal characteristics. Have a father's commands already, so little wait. So, we have a clear battle here, waged between the paternal, that is Manfred, and God, the divine. So you have these two things clashing in an epic battle for who can have absolute power here. Who is going to be the immortal force? Now, Manfred is a little bit tone deaf to this message. A few instances we have him pause and say, I can see the error of my ways, this is probably not the right course to be taking. But more often than not, he doesn't heed the message, he doesn't seem to be getting it into his mind. You can't have absolute power, Manfred. He doesn't seem to get it. So, towards the end, we have the skeleton hermit in one of another strange moments. The hermit comes to speak to Frederick, to try and get Frederick to interpose and stop the marriage, stop all of these crazy things from happening, stop Manfred because this isn't where the lineage is supposed to go. And the skeleton hermit asks, "Wast thou delivered from bondage," said the spectre, "to pursue carnal delights?" Here we have the issue of his excesses, the issue of Manfred privileging his carnal delights, privileging the fact that he is very much invested in the material world, in his wealth, but also in the pursuit of young women. And he's taken this, and Frederick is, as another paternal figure, is merely complacent. A seizing onto that by the monk or by the hermit skeleton who says, really, this is what you're going to choose to do. You were saved in order to debase yourself with these carnal delights. Time and time again, these supernatural characters come in, dropping their giant helmets onto the situation, and everyone is left to try and pick up the pieces. Manfred simply doesn't get it. He believes, I will triumph in the end. There is nothing that can stop me. There are two sides to this, and we can talk about both of these. Manfred, last time we mentioned Gothic oscillation, and this is kind of the final point that I want to make about the Castle of Otranto here. The issue of the Gothic oscillation. On one hand, Manfred is someone who is very much prone to his passions, his carnal delights. This is on page 40. The circumstances of his fortune had given an asperity to his temper, which was naturally humane, and his virtues were always ready to operate when his passions did not obscure his reason. So, man's passions, his animal-like nature, his primal urges, those things that are hidden or repressed within him, his passions come out and drive him to do all kinds of crazy things, to chase the young women all the way through his castle, to not listen to the voice of reason at all. His passion drives him insane, and zealous he goes into the fray here, and does not heed anyone's advice. So, on one hand, Manfred is a madman, but, and this is the beginning of this kind of Gothic tradition in its own right. On the other hand, Manfred is someone who is supremely reasonable, supremely rational. It is quite natural and reasonable to want to have some wealth and power. It is reasonable to want to have a son and continue your family name. And it is very reasonable to doubt some of the stories and some of the things that are going on, such as, did you notice that giant helmet in the courtyard? Is that a little strange to you, Manfred? Well, it can be explained. Then he has told stories of the ghosts, the picture, Alfonso the Good's portrait is when it moves out and it seems to be walking through, and the giant who has his weapons that is terrorizing everyone in the castle. Well, yeah, it's a little strange, but meh, it's all right. Nothing too strange about that. It can be explained. The issue is, of course, it can't be explained. It's supernatural. And Manfred's inability to believe in the powers that are beyond his reason. His inability to be humble before the invisible forces is just as much his downfall. His over-reasonableness is just as much at fault with his downfall as his complete lack of reason. And so man is this kind of oscillating creature who on one hand becomes a gothic nightmare by giving in to his animal urges, and on the other hand prompts a gothic nightmare because the excesses of his reason will not allow him to pay heed to these different signs he seems to be getting. So in the end, Manfred is left broken, having accidentally killed his daughter, and eventually Alfonso's hand literally enters in and rights the court in a kind of deus ex machina, reaches in, fixes the entire situation. And why not? He began by dropping his giant helmet. Why not reach in his giant hand and literally turn things back into their proper place? So I hope you enjoyed reading The Castle of Otranto. I hope you enjoyed one of the staples of Gothic fiction, the first Gothic novel that ever appeared. I hope you can pay attention to its tropes and pay attention to Manfred's oscillations, man's desire for too much power and his urges that he cannot control. All of these things will lead to monsters and ghosts of many breeds that are still yet to be seen. So, I hope you enjoyed this webisode. This is usually when the credits would roll and the music would play, but I do not have such technology. So, enjoy, and we will see you again next week for a discussion of Frankenstein.